Have you ever felt the kind of betrayal that burns so deep it changes who you are forever? The day I buried my husband alone while our children danced at a beach resort, something inside me shattered. And when I made that one phone call, everything they thought they knew about their inheritance, about their future, about who held the real power in this family came crashing down in ways they never saw coming. But before I tell you about my revenge, let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because what happened next will leave you absolutely speechless, so make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't believe how this story ends, and trust me, you don't want to miss a single moment of what I did next. I remember the exact moment when everything I thought I knew about my children died right alongside my husband Richard. And I had built our empire from nothing. 37 years of marriage, 37 years of sacrifice and dreams turned into reality through blood, sweat, and more tears than I could count. And we gave our children everything: private schools, Ivy League educations, trust funds that would make most people weep with envy. But apparently we forgot to give them something far more important. We forgot to give them hearts, because when Richard collapsed in our garden on that sunny Tuesday morning, clutching his chest with those beautiful blue eyes going wide with fear and pain, I screamed for help. I called 911, and then I called our children. I called Marcus first, our eldest, our golden boy, the one Richard had groomed to take over the family business, the real estate empire that spanned 3 states. Marcus, who had his father's eyes and his grandfather's ruthless business sense, picked up on the second ring. And I could hear music in the background, laughter, the kind of carefree sound that felt like knives in my chest at that moment. And I told him, Daddy's had a heart attack. They taking him to St. Mary's Hospital. You need to come now. And there was this pause, this horrible stretching silence before Marcus said, Mom, we're in Cancun. Remember Sarah's birthday weekend? We literally just got here yesterday. I can't just leave. We paid for this whole resort package. And my voice must have sounded strange even to my own ears when I said, your father is dying. Marcus, get on a plane and come home right now. But he said, Mom, you always catastrophize. Remember when you thought Dad had cancer and it was just acid reflux? He's probably fine. The doctors there are great. Keep me posted, okay? And he hung up. He actually hung up while I was standing there watching paramedics do chest compressions on the man who had given him everything. And I called Bethany next, our middle child, our daughter, who looked so much like me when I was young that sometimes it hurt to look at her. Bethany, who had wanted to be a dancer until Richard convinced her business school was more practical. Bethany, who always seemed to simmer with some resentment I could never quite understand, and she didn't even pick up. It went straight to voicemail, so I called again and again until finally she answered with that annoyed edge in her voice and said, What, Mom? I am at the spa. I told you we were doing Sarah's birthday trip this week. And I said, your sister can wait. Your father can't. He's had a massive heart attack. You need to come home. And Bethany laughed this short, bitter sound and said, a massive heart attack, or one of his dramatic indigestion episodes? Because Mom, honestly, you two are made for each other. Always drama, always emergency. And Dad's been saying he's dying for 20 years from his hangnails. Maybe this is the boy who cried wolf situation. And I actually felt something crack inside my chest, something that had nothing to do with Richard's heart attack and everything to do with my own heartbreaking. And I said, Bethany Marie Crawford, your father is on his way to the hospital in an ambulance. If you don't get on a plane right now, you will regret this for the rest of your life. And she said, Mom, I'll come back in 4 days. When the trip is over, tell Dad I love him. And she hung up just like her brother. And finally I called David, our baby, our surprise child, who came along 10 years after Bethany when we thought we were done having children. David, who was sensitive and artistic and never quite fit into Richard's vision of what a son should be. David, who was always Richard's biggest disappointment and somehow also his secret favorite. And David at least had the decency to sound concerned when he answered, but then he said, Mom, Marcus and Beth are here with me. It's Sarah's 30th birthday. We've been planning this for months. Dad would understand. He always said family celebrations were important. And something in me snapped completely. And I screamed into that phone. I screamed like a woman possessed. I screamed that their father was dying. That this wasn't a negotiation, that if they didn't come home right now, they would never forgive themselves. And David's voice got very quiet. And he said, Mom, you're being hysterical. I'll be home in 4 days like we planned. Tell Dad we love him. And to stop scaring you. And the line went dead. And I stood there in our driveway watching the ambulance pull away with my husband inside. And I realized I was utterly alone in that. When the first seed of what would become my revenge planted itself deep in my soul, because I rode in my car behind that ambulance. I sat in that sterile waiting room for 6 hours while doctors tried to save Richard's life, and my phone stayed silent. Not one of my children called back, not one. And when the doctor finally came out with that look on his face, that terrible sympathetic look that means only one thing, I had no one to collapse into, no one to hold me, while I shattered into a million pieces. And I made the calls I had to make to the funeral home, to our lawyer, to Richard's business partners, but I didn't Call my children again. I decided right then that they had made their choice and I had made mine, and when I finally got home that night I walked past all the family photos lining our hallway, Marcus in his graduation gown, Bethany at her wedding, David with his art school portfolio, and I felt nothing but a cold hard fury that was so pure it almost felt like peace. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, 4 days after Richard died, 4 days that I spent in a haze of rage and grief, and something else, something darker that was taking root and growing like poisonous ivy through my veins. And my children did come home. They arrived Friday night rolling their suitcases into the house with their perfect tans and their resort wear and their complete lack of understanding about what they had done, and Marcus hugged me and said, "Mom, I'm so sorry we got here as soon as we could. Traffic from the airport was insane." And Bethany kissed my cheek and said, "You look exhausted, Mom. Did you even sleep?" And David just stood there looking uncomfortable like he always did when emotions ran too high. And I looked at them, these 3 people I had carried in my body, I had nursed and raised and sacrificed everything for, and I felt absolutely nothing except that cold calculation that had been building. And Marcus said, "So what time is the funeral?" "Tomorrow." "And did you pick out Dad's suit and who's doing the eulogy?" Because I prepared some remarks and Bethany was already on her phone scrolling through something, and David was examining the curtains like they held the secrets of the universe, and I said very calmly, "The funeral is at 2:00 at St. Catherine's Church." And Marcus nodded and said, "Great, because we need to leave by 5 to catch our flight back." And I stopped breathing for a moment and I said, "Excuse me," and Bethany looked up from her phone and said, "Oh yeah, Mom, we have to get back. Sarah's actual birthday is Monday. And we planned this whole thing at the resort, a private beach party. We can't miss it. We already missed half the trip for this." And the word "this" hung in the air like a guillotine blade, and I said, "This is your father's funeral." And Marcus had the audacity to look annoyed. And he said, "Mom, we came home, didn't we? We're here, we'll be at the funeral, but life doesn't stop. We have commitments." And that's when I made my decision, when everything that had been churning inside me crystallized into perfect clarity. And I smiled at them. I actually smiled, and I said, "Of course, darlings, I understand you have your lives." And they all looked relieved. Marcus clapped his hands together and said, "Okay, so let's order some food. I'm starving. Resort food is never as good as they claim." And they went into the kitchen like nothing was wrong, like they hadn't just told me they were treating their father's funeral as an inconvenience, as a layover on their way back to their party. And I went upstairs to my bedroom, the bedroom I had shared with Richard for 37 years, and I opened his desk drawer and I pulled out the file I needed and I made a phone call to Harold Peterson, Richard's lawyer, and my voice was steady as steel when I said, "Harold, I need you to prepare some documents for me by tomorrow morning before the funeral, and I need you to be at the church." And Harold, who had known us for 25 years, heard something in my voice that made him ask no questions. He just said, "Of course, Margaret, whatever you need." And I told him exactly what I needed, and when I hung up I felt more powerful than I had in days, maybe in years. And that night at dinner my children laughed and told stories about their resort, about parasailing and beach volleyball and tequila shots. And I watched them like a scientist observing specimens. And Marcus talked about how he was planning to expand the business into commercial properties now that Dad was gone, as if Richard's death had freed him rather than devastated him. And Bethany complained about her husband's spending habits, and David showed us pictures on his phone of some sculpture he wanted to buy, and not once did any of them ask me how I was doing. Not once did they mention their father except in the context of business or inheritance. And I went to bed that night and I didn't cry. I had cried myself empty over the past 4 days, but now there was just that cold hard purpose. And the next morning I woke up and I put on my black dress and I did my makeup carefully, and I looked in the mirror and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, because something fundamental had changed. I had become someone new, someone who understood that love without respect is meaningless, and that children who cannot honor their parents in death did not deserve what they had been given in life. And we drove to the church in 2 cars. Marcus drove one with Bethany and David, and I drove alone, and the church was packed because Richard had been respected in this community. He had been on charity boards and business councils, and he had given generously even if he had been difficult at home. And I sat in the front pew and my children sat beside me, checking their watches, checking their phones. And when it was time for the eulogy, Marcus stood up and read his prepared remarks about what a great businessman Richard had been, what an inspiration, what a legacy, and not one word about what kind of father he was. Not one personal memory, not one moment of genuine emotion. And people were crying in the pews behind us, crying for my husband, and my children sat there dry-eyed and impatient. And when the service ended and we went to the cemetery, I stood at the graveside holding a single white rose, and I watched them lower Richard into the ground, and Marcus checked his phone. Bethany whispered to David about needing to leave soon, and I thought about all the years Richard and I had spent building something we thought would last forever, building a family and a fortune, and instead we had built nothing but a monument to our own failure as parents. After the graveside service ended, people came up to offer condolences and my children smiled appropriately and accepted sympathy like they deserved it, and I watched them perform grief they didn't feel, and something in me that had been cracking finally shattered completely, and Marcus pulled me aside and said, "Mom, we really need to get going, our flight is at 5, and I nodded and I said, "Of course, but first we need to stop by the house there. Something Harold Peterson needs us to sign some paperwork for your father's estate," and Marcus frowned and said, "Can it wait until we come back next month?" And I said, "No, darling, it has to be today, legal requirements, you understand," and he sighed like I was asking him to climb a mountain instead of coming to his own house for 20 minutes, and we all drove back. Marcus and Bethany and David following behind me, and when we got there, Harold was already waiting in the living room with his briefcase and his reading glasses, and my children looked confused, and Marcus said, "What's this about?" and Harold said, "Please sit down, all of you, this one take long," and they sat, Marcus on the sofa, Bethany in the armchair, David perched on the ottoman, and I stood because I wanted to stand. I wanted to look down at them for what came next, and Harold cleared his throat and said, "I've been asked to read a codicil to your father. Well, that was added 2 days ago with your mother as the primary executor and beneficiary," and all 3 of my children looked at me, and Bethany said, "What do you mean added 2 days ago? Dad died 4 days ago," and I smiled and I said, "Actually, darling, your father added this to his will 6 months ago. We both knew his heart was failing. He had been ignoring symptoms for a year, and we had this conversation. We planned for this possibility," and Harold continued, "Your father, Richard James Crawford, being of sound mind and body, did specify that in the event of his death, the distribution of his estate, valued at approximately $47 million, would be contingent on certain conditions being met," and Marcus leaned forward and said, "Conditions? What conditions?" and Harold read in his precise lawyer voice, "The primary condition is that all beneficiaries must be present at the reading of the will within 48 hours of death, and must have attended the funeral service in its entirety. Any beneficiary who fails to meet these conditions forfeits their inheritance entirely," and the room went very quiet, and David said, "But here we came to the funeral," and I let the silence stretch, and then I said, "You came to the funeral, yes, but you were not present for your father when it mattered, were you?" and Bethany's face went pale and she said, "What are you talking about?" and I said, "I'm talking about the fact that when I called you when your father was dying, you all chose a birthday party over him. I'm talking about the fact that you couldn't be bothered to come home until 4 days later. I'm talking about the fact that even now at his funeral you were checking your phones and planning your escape back to your resort vacation." And Marcus stood up and said, "Mom, you can be serious. This is grief talking. You're not thinking clearly," and I laughed, and it sounded harsh even to my own ears, and I said, "Oh, I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, and Harold has more to read. Dawn to you, Harold," and Harold nodded, and continued, "Furthermore, in the event that the primary beneficiaries are disqualified, the entirety of Richard Crawford's estate, including all business holdings, properties, investments, and liquid assets, will transfer to Margaret and Crawford with full discretion to distribute or withhold as she sees fit." And Marcus's face went red, and he said, "You can do this. The business is mine. Dad promised me," and I said, "Your father promised you a lot of things contingent on you being the son he raised you to be, but you're not, are you? A selfish, entitled child who thinks money grows on trees and that family is something you deal with when it's convenient." And Bethany was crying now, real tears finally, and she said, "Mom, please, we made a mistake, okay? We should have come sooner, but you can't punish us like this." And I said, "Punish you, darling? I'm not punishing you. I am simply honoring your father's wishes and my own, because you see, when Richard added this codicil 6 months ago, he said to me, 'Margaret, if something happens to me and our children can't be bothered to show up to say goodbye, then they don't deserve what we built.'" And I agreed with him, and David was shaking, and he said, "Mom, I wanted to come. I told them we should leave immediately, but they outvoted me." And I looked at my youngest, my sensitive artist, who had never been able to stand up for anything, and I said, "David, you're 27 years old. You had a phone, you had credit cards, you could have come home on your own, but you didn't. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." And Marcus was pacing now, running his hands through his hair, and he said, "This is insane. We'll contest this. I'll take you to court." And Harold spoke up and said, "I should mention that your father anticipated that response. The will has been reviewed by 3 independent law firms. It's ironclad. Any attempt to contest it will result in automatic legal fees being deducted from any future inheritance, should your mother choose to eventually distribute assets. And also, any beneficiary who contests the will is permanently barred from receiving anything, even if Mrs. Crawford changes her mind later." And I watched understanding dawn on their faces, watched them realize they had lost everything in one moment of selfishness, and Bethany got up and came to me and grabbed my hands and said, Mom, please, I have a mortgage, I have expenses. Tom lost his job last month, we need this. And I pulled my hands away and I said, you should have thought about that before you chose margaritas over your father. And Marcus said, this is cruel, Mom, this is vindictive. And I said, no, darling, cruel is leaving your mother alone at the hospital while your father dies. Cruel is treating his funeral like an inconvenience. Cruel is 37 years of sacrifice and love meeting absolutely no loyalty in return. And David said, so that's it, we get nothing. And I said, that's up to me now, isn't it? Your father left me everything and I will decide if and when any of you deserve a single penny. And right now, looking at you all, I don't think you deserve anything. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my life, but also somehow the most liberating, because I had spent 37 years being Richard's wife and 30 plus years being Marcus and Bethany and David's mother, and I had forgotten how to be just Margaret. And my children tried everything. Marcus sent lawyers who I sent away with Harold's impeccable paperwork. Bethany came to the house crying and begging, and I closed the door in her face. David wrote me long letters about how sorry he was, how he had always been the family scapegoat, and this wasn't fair. And I burned every single one without reading past the first paragraph because I was done. I was so completely done, and I took over Richard's business with a ferocity that surprised everyone, especially his former partners who thought the widow would be easy to manipulate. But I had sat in on every business dinner for decades. I had listened to every strategy session. I had absorbed more than anyone realized, and I was ruthless. I consolidated power. I made decisions that increased our profits by 30% in the first quarter, and I donated heavily to charities in Richard's name, real charities that help people, not tax shelters. And I started to build something new, something that was mine. And about 2 months after the funeral, I got a call from St. Catherine's Church from Father Morrison, who had presided over Richard's funeral. And he said, Margaret, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but there's someone here who wants to speak with you. And I said, who? And he said, a young woman named Sarah. She says she's your children's cousin. And my heart stopped, because Sarah, the birthday girl, the reason my children had been in Cancun, the reason they had missed everything. And I said, put her on. And this young voice came through the phone shaking with emotion, and she said, Mrs. Crawford, you don't know me, but I'm David's girlfriend's sister. I was the one having the birthday, and I need you to know something. I need you to know that I didn't know your husband had died until we got back. And they told me casually like it was nothing. And when I found out what they had done, I was horrified, and I said, why are you calling me Sarah? And she said, because they're telling everyone you a monster, that you stole their inheritance, that you vindictive and cruel. And I was there, Mrs. Crawford. I saw them laughing on the beach while you were burying your husband, and I saw Marcus take a call from you and dismiss it. I heard Bethany say her mom was always dramatic about everything, and I watched David go along with it all, and I think what you did was right. And I started crying then for the first time in weeks, and I said, thank you, Sarah, thank you for telling me that. And she said, I am so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Crawford, and I'm sorry my birthday became the excuse they used for their cruelty. And after I hung up, I sat in Richard's study looking at his photos on the wall, and I thought about legacy and what it really means. And that night I made a decision, and I called Harold and I said, I want to set up a foundation, the Richard Crawford Foundation for Family Values, and I want to fund it with $10 million, and I wanted to provide college scholarships for young people who demonstrate genuine compassion and family loyalty. And Harold said, that's a beautiful idea, Margaret. And I said, I am not done. I want you to draft new documents. I want each of my children to receive a letter on what would have been Richard's 65th birthday next year, and in that letter I want them to know they will each receive $1 million, not the $15 million each they would have gotten, but $1 million on the condition that they spend the next year proving to me they understand what family means, what sacrifice means, what love without conditions looks like. And Harold said, and if they can't prove it, and I said, then that money goes to the foundation too, because I'm not doing this for revenge anymore, Harold. I am doing this because somewhere in those 3 selfish adults are the children I raised, the children who used to hold my hand and tell me they loved me. And if there's even a chance I can find those children again, I have to try. And he said, you a remarkable woman, Margaret. And I said, no, I am just a mother who finally learned that love has to have boundaries, even with your own children. And over the next months I started to build a new life. I sold the big house with all its memories and bought a smaller place by the lake. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before Marcus was born. I made new friends, women my age, who were also discovering who they were outside of being wives and mothers. And I was happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't been in years. And my children each tried to reach me in their own ways. Marcus sent flowers every week, which I donated to nursing homes. Bethany left voicemails that slowly changed from angry to desperate to finally thoughtful. David showed up at my new house one day and just sat on the porch for 3 hours until I came out, and when I finally opened the door he said, I don't "Do want your money, Mom? I just want to understand what I did that was so unforgivable." And I invited him in and we talked for the first time and maybe ever, and I told him about the phone calls about standing alone at the hospital, about watching his father being lowered into the ground while his children checked the time, and David cried and said, "I was weak, Mom. I've always been weak." And I said, "Yes, you were, but weakness can be overcome if you choose to be strong." And he said, "How do I prove to you I've changed?" And I said, "You don't prove it to me, David, you prove it to yourself. You build a life you proud of. You become a man who would drop everything for the people he loves, and then maybe we can start over." And he left that day, but something had shifted, and as I sit here now a year later looking out at the lake watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple, I think about Richard, and I think he would be proud of what I did, not because of the money or the revenge, but because I finally stood up. I finally demanded that our children be worthy of what we built, and tomorrow is Richard's birthday, and tomorrow my children will each receive their letters and their offers, and I don't know what they choose, but I know this: I am no longer the woman who stood in that driveway watching an ambulance drive away. I am someone new, someone stronger, someone who learned that the deepest love sometimes means the hardest choices, and whatever happens next, I'll face it the way I face everything now, with my eyes open, my heart guarded, and my spine made of steel, because that one phone call to Harold, that one decision to stop being a victim and start being a force, it didn't just change my children's lives, it changed mine. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. It's becoming so completely yourself that you no longer need anything from the people who failed you, and that right there is freedom.